All right, so we have talked about AI in education, which was probably one of the most important things that people, I guess, if we look at like what's underrated or not talked about as much, right? AI in education is not really talked about as much, right? We talked about customizing textbooks, course creation, things like that, But another hot topic that comes to mind for me, right? And I know it's something that is close to you and close to your heart, right? Is AI and religion. Okay, so when we talk about that, that's something that people don't talk about as much, and they probably try not to because they don't want to intertwine the two, right? Because you think about a worst case scenario is that we have two worlds. You have technology, right, the world, and you have religious world, right? They kind of separate it. And
Mhm.
when I look at throughout my college career, I'm taking physics and all this good stuff, right? You have things that you believe are factual, right? And your religion is like faith, right? I believe in this because I cannot touch it. I haven't seen it, but there's faith there, right? And if the machine were to possess the ability to think like a human, or a machine were able to make decisions like autonomously, right?
Mhm.
Then should it be considered a person? Right? That's the question that I'll ask.
It's a good
Right?
question. Yeah.
So what's your thoughts on AI and religion? How do you believe those things should actually intertwine, right? You have
Yeah.
the religious communities that probably have a significant stake in this conversation because throughout years before AI started to become something very tangible, very important, right? Various faiths would hold a strong opinion on things, and it regarding like creation and of the soul
Mhm.
and all that
Mhm.
stuff like that, right? And as AI starts to move forward, you have researchers, you have doctors out there, you have people that are creating theories and all that good stuff. They're starting to engage in those experiments to prepare for the future. So what's your thoughts on AI and religion and how they intertwine?
So at the like very very top level, right? I think one of the things you said that really like resonated with me is this notion of technology and religion being these two separate worlds, and like never the two shall meet. And that's actually something that I just sort of at the core I think like that doesn't have to be the case. And like I first
Right.
of all I fundamentally agree. Like a huge number of people absolutely do view it this way. Like these are two opposing forces. There's actually something I encourage like everyone to Google this. It's called pantheism.
And
And yeah, and it's actually, if you kind of look back, this is sort of religious system philosophy. I think the line between those two is necessarily pretty blurry, right? But a huge number of sort of famous scientists, Tesla and Edison and like all these folks, right, actually adhere to this kind of belief, which it kind of is reminiscent of Newton's old God is the best clockmaker in the world sort of analogy, right? And
mhm,
the idea is really that, look, like we know we have creative forces in the world, right? Like humans do stuff, right? And stuff happens
mhm,
as a result, right? And the assertion that many religions then jump to, right, is like, okay, there's like conscious motivation behind that, right?
mhm,
And pantheism's sort of assertion is like, whether or not there is a conscious motivation behind that, like the forces exist and stuff happens, right?
mhm.
So does
Right.
it does it really matter, right?
Does it matter, right?
Yeah, and it's it's kind of funny, right? Because like in there's some like pantheistic Christian sects that say like this is totally like synonymous, but then the like flip side, this notion that the like consciousness or God, if you will, is separate from us
Mhm,
as opposed to separate from us and acting through us as opposed to literally us. Which when I define it that way, it seems like such a slight difference, right? And indeed,
mhm,
it's the difference between pantheism and panentheism, right? It's like those
mhm.
two letters, but those two letters almost, right? Like that's like what I think that's what a lot of organized religion is based on. I don't think that's the most important aspect, right? I think that there's always going to be things that we don't know, right? And I think religion fundamentally is just like a codified way that you decide to fill in those blanks. Like everyone's got a religion, right? And I don't think there's any conflict with that in technology. And certainly, like I consider myself both highly religious and obviously, highly technical.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I agree, right? I mean, growing up, going through college, it was you have this fact, right? And then you have faith. And I always thought, man, I grew up in church, right? That's how I
Hmm.
grew
Hmm.
up. To my mother, going to church, things like that. My father, my mother, and my father both going to church. Even now to this
Hmm.
day, they
Hmm.
do, right? And that doesn't mean that I don't have something like solid, right? Something grounded, right? Like a faith that I believe in. But also, you have facts that are out there, right? I believe
Hmm.
in not fighting against the machine, sort of joining the machine because it's almost inevitable, right? It's going
Yeah.
to take over. Why not figure out a way to merge the two, right? I mean,
Yeah.
eventually, religious groups religious groups in the meantime are going to really have to introduce that to even succeed and further their career and further whatever they're trying to do in their religion groups, right?
And honestly, right? I mean, I think when you look at the benefits of religion, like the tiny little literal interpretations of obscure, like passages, it's so unimportant. That was always my view, right? And so, like, I went to a Methodist preschool, for instance, right? And
Hmm.
like we every single day we'd have sermon. I remember raising my hand at one point, right, and saying like, oh, like, and I don't even remember what it was, but it was some story where some impossible thing happens, right? I'm like,
Yeah,
that could
yeah,
never happen, right?
yeah,
And they got so mad. And I remember just being really confused and being like, well, why does it matter if it couldn't literally happen? Right?
right,
Like it's still like a story, and like the story still has a value. Like it doesn't. And I remember just being so confused by how fixated they were on whether or not like the thing literally happened. And I'm like, I don't know.
right,
I was always really confused by it, right? Because it sort of feels like you're missing the forest for the trees.
right. Oh, forest with the trees, right?
Yeah.
I like that concept, right? Because so when I look at even my son growing up and
Mm.
children growing up, right? Curiosity comes to mind, right?
Oh
Because what you
yeah.
did was say, I'm curious about this, right? I'm raising my
Yeah.
hand, I'm trying to figure it out, what's going on, right? And that's what technology is kind of about to me. When you're thinking technology, you're thinking
Mm.
machine learning, you're thinking artificial intelligence, you're thinking future, right? Predicting the future, things like that. It's just, hey, I'm just curious about what the future holds and I'm trying to figure it out, right? We all are curious, but then sometimes we say, hey, I'm gonna leave it in the higher power's hand, right?
Hmm.
Versus
Hmm. Hmm.
versus saying, hey, look, I'm gonna let technology show me because there's data behind it and I'm gonna I'm gonna use that, right? So,
Yeah.
you can trust either one, but I think that all that there's certain parts where they can kind of merge a little bit, right? Where
Totally.
religion can be able to say, hey, look, I can use some of this predictive analysis. I can use some of this AI, some of this, stop. If you're thinking about autonomous vehicles, right? Being able to say, I'm going to stop and not hit this car because
Mhm.
because I've been able to know, what has been implemented in place, right? So something as simple as that, religious groups can use that. They can use AI. Don't fight it, right? Just kind of embrace it and merge it and love it, and pick and choose what benefits you and what you want to do going forward in the future.
Yeah, I think the most powerful sort of like tenet of any religion, right, is the embrace of doubt, right? I think
Yeah.
that you can kind of draw like a like stark line, right? I think that there's
Yep.
religious views out there that are like doubt is like awful, it's unnatural, and like you got to stamp it out from your mind, right? And there's other
Mhm.
views that are like, nope, like doubt, that is a totally normal thing. Like curiosity, doubt, like that is a part of the human experience. Like you got to embrace it, you got to see it through, right? And
Right.
that really like I'm so very much in that camp, and that's a lot of what I think is key, both in really critically in AI, right? Is that idea that you're going to re-examine the assumptions you have, right, and figure
Right.
out if maybe there's a better approach.
Right. Right. This is so random, right? It just made me think about it. Your thoughts on, is it a matter of like what your interests are, right? Growing up, right? Is it a
Mm.
like whether you decide to say I want to mix both, or AI and religion, and then also whether I want to just say with religion or AI, because when I when I look at the way I've grown up, right, it was
Mm.
religion, right, but then I got into college, and then technology became something that was so fast. Physics is what really made me say, hey, you're talking about the black hole, you're talking about all this stuff. This has happened, they're saying, because based off of the data they found, based off of facts, right? I can touch it. So it feels
Yeah.
good to say, I can touch this. I know it. I believe it, right? And then it kind of fights against what people who have grown up and not experienced things like that, right? Physics, like things that you and I have experienced, where we can say that. Do you think that it actually plays a role? Do you think that you could say that the reason why some people are not willing to maybe intertwine the two is because they haven't experienced is exposure, right?
I think that's a part of it. I think that another big piece of it, and a lot of it is time, right? I think that younger exposure certainly would help, but as you get older, there's sort of this notion that like changing your mind, I think it becomes harder and harder and harder, right? And it's sort of like if you decide, hey, actually, this other interpretation is okay, like I don't need to fight against X so hard or whatever.
Right.
You're sort of like, oh well, me of a year ago, oh what a jerk and an idiot that guy was, right? And I think
Right.
sort of similar. There's like two ways that you can respond to that. I think reasonably, it's a very uncomfortable situation to be in. Right? I think you can either say like, "Oh, that's uncomfortable. I won't do it," or be like, "Wow, it's uncomfortable, but the only thing that would be more uncomfortable would be not doing it." Right?
Right.
Yeah,
Great
but
point.
I think like in the Life of Pi, right? Is you'd be shocked what humans can get used to, and I think it is very very easy, especially when folks have kind of like practiced those sort of like approaches to things to kind of cut off parts of their mind, just like not like I'm not going to think about X, like that doesn't really mesh, but like I'm just not going to think about it, right? And I think people are really really like frighteningly good at that, and I think that that's part of it is just it's practice in taking parts of your life and be like, I will not apply critical thinking to X, right?
Yeah. That's a practice. Like you have to, like you said, that's something you have to. It's a gift, if you will.
Yeah,
Really.
yeah, and it's something that like you can very easily it's something that atrophies. I think like anything else.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so let's go back to because education is such an interesting topic to me, right? I have two
Mhm.
kids, and I'm always interested in education, even before the two kids, right? I'm like obsessively interested in like learning and gaining more knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So I've been through plenty of programs, but one of the most fascinating programs I have been through, even going through
Mhm.
college and then high school, was more of a STEM program, right? Science,
Mhm.
technology,
Mhm. Mhm.
engineering, and math. Okay, and so when people create those programs, they're so important to us because what we start to realize is that those programs help us with our future, right? Those programs help us gain so much knowledge, even outside of science, technology, engineering, and math, right?
Oh,
Just
absolutely.
creative thinking, right? Being able to have critical thinking skills, things like that, right? Being able to
Mhm.
just have exposure. I always say exposure is key. If you're exposed to those types of
100%.
things, it's so important. But then I do see there's problems, right? When it comes down to bringing STEM to the environment, right?
Yep.
And a lot of people don't understand that STEM is such a major part of our world, just going forward. Even if you don't do anything in science, technology, engineering, or math, but if you get somebody involved with that, the exposure is key. Okay,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
and so
Yeah.
I want to know, and this is coming from me. This might be a personal interest of mine too,
Mm.
because I want to create conferences. I want to create focus groups and things like that only on STEM and with children and with children and even adults, right? To try to
Yeah.
be able to help them understand the importance of being able to include STEM into their life and stuff. And so,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on making? How can we make STEM more inclusive? How can we continue to embrace STEM? How can we embed that into the educational systems and things like that?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll probably there's just so much on this topic
I know
here,
it is.
right? Yeah. It's like,
Go for it.
okay,
Go for
where do
it.
I start, right? It's like, okay, so I think, first and foremost, right? I think that one of the big like macro issues with education is that we don't give kids a lot of flexibility in what
Mm,
they go and do, right, and what they decide to learn, right. So I think that's one key in all of this that I think is difficult and really trying. I
mhm,
think that another thing, and it's sort of sort of this I don't know, it's a recursive problem, if you will, right? Which is that when you don't have STEM teachers, right? Or you know, when you, it's like, because we have neglected this part of the education system for so long, right? It means we've got a serious dearth in good STEM teachers, right? Which then means our ability to offer STEM classes, right, more broadly, is then also fundamentally limited, right? Which then just kind of goes and repeats the cycle, right? Which is tough, right? I think one thing that I think at like a macro level, and I will say that I think the way I describe it, I kind of survived in the traditional K through 12 education system by the skin of my teeth, right? I just barely made it through, and then went to a school, college actually, like that was very much like a Montessori style education for engineering, right? It's called Olin College. Very awesome. And they actually do a lot of research there on, and it's specifically engineering education. So it's not the whole of STEM, but this question, right, of how do we change it to improve it? Because I don't know, the assertion sort of being that we're not very good at it. I think one of the big issues that I see that makes me so frustrated, and I think we'll kind of link to this probably a little bit at the end of the talk as well, is sort of this gatekeeping aspect to it. Right. I think that especially, a lot of folks kind of have this notion like it was hard for me to learn. Right. And so it's going to be hard for you to learn as well.
Right.
So actually, and this is actually one of the things that I think is because I think I don't know, again, it's a huge topic, but I think the privatization of schools is a topic in this mix. Right. And one of the things that I always thought was really interesting, and, I went to public school my whole life. And I'm a huge proponent of public schools, and people are always like, oh, private schools are so good. And I say, absolutely, no, they're not. If you look at top schools in the country, they are public, period. Right. And a lot of people don't realize that. So I did some more digging, and it's actually really funny because when you look at private schools, right. And, I think some people are big proponents of them. The only metric that you can show private schools outperform public schools in is parental satisfaction. Which is so interesting, right? And it turns out that in practice, parental satisfaction is actually really tied to whether the way their kids are being learned is hard and whether it's close to the way that they learned. So the thing that's really strange, because also private schools, they've got crazy amounts more resources than public schools. So you would expect them to perform better, but they don't. And what it actually turns out is that parents force private schools, because they're the ones making that decision, to actually use less effective education methods because it's closer to what they did and they don't trust new education methods. But again, like we have gotten better at educating people in the last 60 years. So I think it's another thing that's really tough, is that people have this notion that STEM education should be, rote memorization, right? And just like algebra problems till you puke, right? And frankly, I just don't think that's a great way of educating. I think that, Finland has done an incredible job of changing the way we look at K through 12 education by making it heavily play-based, right? And I think that when we look at STEM, like nowhere other than STEM, I think is that more incredible. Like if you give someone
like gamification when you say play-based,
even it's just like giving kids tools and saying like play, just like do what you want. Right.
Yeah.
And honestly, the most incredible. So I showed up at college. I didn't know anything at material science, but there was a scanning electron microscope that they let us use. And it turns out, like, if you've got some guy, and there was some guy that worked there that knew how to maintain the thing and work it, they're not that expensive to own. But just having access to this, like, I learned so much. No one honestly had to tell me anything other than like, pick a project. Tell me something you think is fun. Right. And I think, we just really underestimate I think there is a profound intrinsic motivation in people to learn. I think there is that curiosity, but I think that we kind of, in treating education more like daycare, I think we actually weed that out of kids. Right. Yeah. So sorry, I realize we just like spanned a whole bunch of stuff, but that's some of it.
You bring up an amazing point, and when you say, I took keywords from that.
Thank you for listening to The Data is My Science Podcast,
one word that
the
you
show that
used,
makes data
which was
your
flexibility,
passion.
right?
With your
which was
host,
very important.
Dapper. Dapper
And one
Data.
word that I derived from everything that you just said was exposure, right? Exposure to me is so key, right? And people and it hit me one time when my son was very, very, very young. And he said, this is something simple, nothing to do with tech, but I can take this and put it in technology terms as well, or phrases. But when my son was, had to be like 7 years old, right? One kid that he went to school with, he ended up going I think over the summertime, he traveled across the world, right? Came back and said, hey, look, I I know all these things, right? You got all these cool things going on. You know, he went to China, he went all these different places, and he said it right. So my son came home and he said, Dad, man, this kid is so smart, right? He knows everything in the world. He knows everything about everything, right? And I said, well, why do you say that? You know, why? You know, he made it seem as if he was not as smart as that kid, right? I'm like, you're only 7 years old, 8 years old. You know, what do you mean? So, the way he explained it, it was all about exposure. The kid was exposed to those things. So therefore he was able to come back and say, hey, look, I know all these cool things, right? So then I took him the next summer. I say, look, we're gonna go to Bermuda, we're going these places and stuff. You're gonna see
Yeah.
pink sands here, you're gonna do all these different things, right? Saved up for it, great. He went there and he came back and I realized that that was the right move to make. So if you take that aspect and you take that the theory of exposure, right, and you implement that into STEM as well, if we expose our kids more, right, you know, the parental satisfaction thing that you talked about,
Yeah.
like if I was to say, hey, look, I am parentally like satisfied with exposing my kid to STEM on a regular basis. I mean, I told you before, right, when we talked about it, that my son is in Python classes, right? At the age of
Right.
11, and
You
he's
could,
been doing it
yeah.
since he was 9 years old. So obviously, he's going to be smarter than the average person in Python when he gets to like 30, maybe. You know, who knows?
Yeah.
Because if he continues to implement that into his life, and he
And,
loves
and you know what? Even if he doesn't do that, right,
it,
he's going to be well
right?
served. It is one of the things I tell people. And, you know, I had this crazy experience when I was on my gap year. Like, I really wanted to do research at UCLA. And I was like a really smart math kid. Like, I knew a lot of science, right? I'm like, great. Like, I think that should be enough, right?
Right.
It's not. It turns out for pretty much anything that you want to do, like a little bit of programming knowledge, not even much, right? Like just a little bit of programming knowledge, it's like a superpower, right? As it turns out, I just remember I was so frustrated because all of the research I wanted to do, I was like, oh, well, I want to test this math equation. It's like, well, I have to figure out how to code it. Oh, shoot, right? It's like, or like, hey, I just want, you know, someone to be able to like put some values into a form, right? Just, again, super, super basic stuff. But it's like, oh, you know, I need just like a little bit of programming knowledge to do everything that I want, right? But like at the time, I didn't have it. So I just got super frustrated and quit, right? But now I just tell people, it's like, no matter what you do, like a little bit of programming knowledge will be like a superpower.
I completely agree. No matter what you do in life, a little bit of programming knowledge would help you through it. I mean, when you talk about critical thinking outside the box, I don't care what you do, it would make you feel like you can do anything, right? I was a programmer. I started off as I was a programmer. So I always say if you start off in, I mean, it's no offense to the networking guys, right? The hardware people and stuff, right? But the people who deal with hardware on a regular basis, it's harder for them to understand programming, right? But if you start off as a programmer, which I did, I was doing Java development, right? When I first started, that was the first thing I started with, and then C++ and things like that. And I got into it, and I didn't even understand like the most detailed things, right? Like understanding, if we can get real technical for a moment, garbage collection, trying to figure out how to make sure I'm not, wasting resources and things like that. With programming, you don't have to know all that, right? Just high level understanding the basic syntax and things like that.
Yeah. But it's like not everyone needs to be a writer, but everyone should still take English class, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And so, man, it's spot on, man. So I'm glad we had that conversation. All right. So another thing that I really wanted to touch on before we get, out of here is really understanding, and this is for the people this is for the audience, because I have a lot of people in my audience who are not very, very technical, but they love the conversation we have about technology and artificial intelligence. Like this podcast will really, really hit them, right? Because
Yeah.
we're not getting deep into the stuff that you and I probably could chop up about, outside of it, right? We're getting into algorithms, supervised learning and things like that. Who cares about that for this audience, right? So this audience, right, they really care about, they hear machine learning, they hear artificial intelligence, they hear data science, and all they can think about is, I may not have a job in the future, right? and I get it, right? It's like, okay, the robot, the machine is there. They're going to take my job. They're going to take my career. I'm fighting against it because of that, right? And I did some research, and people are saying 85 million jobs will be replaced by machines with AI by the year 2025, right? So this is what they said, right? I know, right? So this is what
2025.
This is what a report from the World Economic Forum said. Now, my belief is that I don't think people should be worried about their jobs being lost, right? I think it should be more about, my belief is that they will shift the roles of jobs. And what I mean by that is, you may, something as simple as working at McDonald's, right? You may not be behind the register anymore, but the children now, right, that we're teaching this stuff to, we need to teach them to be programmers or somebody that are developing those robots or understand that stuff that is behind the robot that's behind the register, if that makes sense,
No,
What's your
totally.
thoughts?
Yeah, no, and like I think that there's folks on both sides of this, right? I think that there's both folks that aren't super technical, don't necessarily know that much about AI, that are worried about automation. Again, reasonably so. There's also folks on the AI side that are actively saying, we're coming for your jobs, which is one of the reasons it's reasonable.
You're right. I didn't think about that.
People do that, yeah, but I don't. Like Indico does not, right? I'm much more in your sort of camp, right? And I think that generally, when you look back through history, right, that has been the general arc, is that when you see, and again, I think that people thinking that these jobs are going to be automated out of existence, I think they profoundly underestimate how unique and special human cognition is, right? And I think fundamentally, some of it stems from this notion that like the stuff that humans are trying to get done is like some objective function. It's really not, right? We're trying to make ourselves happy, right? And no one is better at making humans happy than other humans, frankly, right? So I think that, like at its very, very core, that's why humans are never going to go away. It doesn't make sense, no matter how advanced AI gets.
Right? Emotions, right?
I mean, emotions are key. Yeah, exactly. It's like humans are a key part of the equation, right? It's like that's who we're building stuff for at the end of the day, right? So I think also generally when you look at the arc of history, now what I think could be believable, right? Now I think that we could potentially do 85 million people's worth of work with AI in by 2025, but that's very, very different than saying we would displace 85 million people, right? That's saying that like we could maybe get, every person in the workforce, 15% more efficient, right? Very, very different kind of thing, right? Because when you make people more efficient and when you build sort of this supporting material, right? Even if you look at manufacturing, and people hold manufacturing up as like, oh, the manufacturing industry was like decimated by automation. It wasn't. It really wasn't, right? You have more people employed in that sector now than you ever have in the past, right? But the sector just got so big that it broke up into several sectors, right? And that's, I think that is what traditionally happens, right? Is that you see, even today, there's not a single job that's ever been automated out of existence. Even the example that people use of an elevator operator still exists. There are still absolutely elevator operators out there, right? And so that's fundamentally the way that I look at it, is that I think that, each one of these steps, so long as we make it, responsibly. There is absolutely risk. I don't want to say there's no risk, right? But if you assume that we manage to get to the point where this is implemented widely and responsibly, I think that you see more better paying jobs that are less focused on rote work. Right.
No, I agree, and I always told myself as a developer growing up, I was like, automate myself out of a job. That's what a mentor told me. He said, you want to automate yourself out of a job, right? And so I would sit there and make sure that by the time I'm done, all the projects I want to do is really automated to where I don't have to really be there anymore. I can kind of
that's awesome.
Myself to another one, right? And I mean, developers have that gift, right? When you're deep into it, and that's why I always say, man, if you can learn to be able to automate things, shoot, at home, right? You're doing all these manual tasks all the time. And I'm like, look, just automate that crap, man. I'm tired of it.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the thing is like, you look for an easier way to get things done, right? Like that, it just has a positive impact, right? Even if you're like buying something to then get that done, right? Like you're making your life better and whoever made the thing that improves it, making their life better.
Exactly, right. Buying back your time, right? For certain things.
Exactly. Right. As it makes sense, right?
Yeah. So we talked about AI, we talked about education, we talked about religion with AI, right? And I love this topic on AI. One of the things that I wanted to highlight real quick was the pros and cons, right? If you can give me what your thoughts are on like maybe one or two pros and then maybe one or two cons of AI, that would be great, from somebody that has definitely been heavily involved in it. What's your thoughts?
I think that it's a Spider-Man kind of problem, frankly. So I'm going to sum up the pros and cons. It's just with great power comes great responsibility, right? And that is the issue with AI, right? There's that meme out there that's like, machine learning, do stupid stuff faster with, more energy, right? And that is the downside, and that's also the positive, right? Is that like on the positive, we've got this new technology that people are referring to as the fourth industrial revolution, and it can impact our lives that positively. That is absolutely a real possibility. On the flip side, right, you see people extremely worried about encoding all of the bad things in our society today into our society forever out into the future. That is also a very real risk, right? And they're fundamentally associated with each other, right? Because then also on the flip side, you say, okay, this is the really big problem is that we can code all of our issues forever into the future. The pro is that, okay, we've got now a numeric way of looking at it, viewing it, having transparency into it. We could potentially solve those problems as well, right? So I think it's everything in AI. I think there's two sides to that coin. Is like you could make things bad forever, or you could actually figure out how to fix them.
Right. And from my point of view, I think about, reduction in human error, right? You got AI that can solve some of those problems, right? Take risks instead of like humans taking those risks, right? Minimizing radiation exposure at a power plant, something like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And then I look at some of the cons. I think about, okay, is there a possibility of a more unemployment? Maybe, right? In the future.
It could be. Certainly in a transitional state, especially, right?
Right. And then maybe humans being lazy, when it comes down to things,
Like Wall-E, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So lastly, usually I end with what I call a dope nugget or gem, right? At the end of it. And so I do want to close out this podcast. I really appreciate you being on here, Slater. Is there, so from my point of view, based off of what we've talked about, and it's been a lot that we talked about, right? Education, AI, all this good stuff. It's important that we don't sort of silo off in a bubble in the field of AI, right? That's something that kind of hit me pretty hard based off of what we talked about. And then also allowing the flexibility with kids and exposure is key, right? Definitely. Exposure and flexibility, those two words, exposure and flexibility, educational systems to start to really hone in on trying to allow that type of a world for kids growing up in the STEM field, especially, but also in general, right?
And honestly, in AI, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So is there anything that any nugget that you want to leave the audience with?
I mean, I don't know. I actually kind of liked that. With great power comes great responsibility. I think that that's,
Uh,
a lot of it's like kind of what I want people to have it in the back of
yeah.
their minds for the next decade, right? Because like
Mhm.
I think there's incredible potential with AI, but the risks are real. And while certainly there's the potential to build a better life for everyone, there's also the potential to do real harm and real damage, which we've already seen.
Right, right. It's like you can be so smart, but you can use it for good or bad. Which one,
Totally.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's also, like that little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing,
Oh, right.
yeah. I think, like let's make sure it's like understand what we're doing today before we automate it, not automate it and then understand what we were doing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So before we end, real quick, let's be really quick. I always end with something that I like to call overrated, underrated. We talked about it. It's a fun game. We want to know the genius, the fun behind the genius, if that makes sense, right? So you have
Totally.
these people that come on the podcast. They're very educated. They know technology. They know about AI, supervised learning. They know about machine learning. We can talk all the techie geek stuff in the world, but we want to know how fun is this person, right? What do they think about outside of it? So some of the traits, some of the characters, some of the things that are pretty fun in this world to talk about and have different discussions about besides technology, right? So I bring overrated, underrated. And so I ask you a series of questions, and you say whether you think it's overrated, underrated. You get to decide whether you want to continue to explain it. If you want to, that's fine. If not, then we just keep it moving. But I have about good 6, 7, 8 questions here, so I'll throw out a word and you say overrated, underrated. Ready to go?
Perfect. I got it.
All right,
Yeah.
cool. All right, school.
Underrated. Sorry. Oh god, you
Underrated.
start hard. In the US, underrated.
I did.
Yeah.
In the U.S., underrated. Oh, okay,
Yeah. In
okay,
the US, underrated. Maybe not in every country.
okay. All right, plants.
Oh, underrated for sure. Oh
Uh-huh.
man, plants. I mean, they make you happy. They make the world a better place.
Mhm.
I foraged some hen of the wood mushrooms last weekend. They were delicious.
Oh man, nice.
Yeah.
All right. Gaming.
Oh, I'm gonna have to also go underrated on this one.
Uh-huh.
I think there were a lot of really great TED Talks talking about how gaming teaches like collaboration and collective problem solving, right? And I think there's a lot to that. I think gaming, it's modern art, and I think there's games that teach a lot of really important social skills.
Yeah, and it's crazy because with gaming, it was a certain period of time, about 3 or 4 years straight, where people would say, "Man, I guess depending on the generation, you would
Mhm.
say, oh my goodness, all they're doing, they're not going outside anymore. They're always inside. They're on the games, things like that." But when you start to sit down and realize what they're really learning from these things, it is benefits, right? It benefits to all these
Totally.
different aspects of things, and
I
sometimes I'm
mean,
thinking,
everything in moderation. To be fair, there's definitely
right,
folks that
right,
game
that's
too
what it is.
much.
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, right? You're in the house, you're gaming too much, you're not being
Yeah.
exposed to anything else, right? You're just gaming.
Yeah.
Sometimes I I remember when my son would always play Roblox. I'm like, you're focusing on being the consumer and not the producer, right? Things like that. And then I started
Interesting.
realizing,
Yeah.
okay, when I started to sit down and a lot of times we make these assumptions without really understanding what they're doing and how it's working, how it's connecting with their brains. Because the future is going to be
Totally.
things like YouTube and gaming and all that stuff, right? It's not
I mean,
really.
look at Minecraft, right? And I think Minecraft is incredible, right? Because like especially if you've ever played Minecraft, right? Because I mean, objectively speaking, Minecraft it's a terrible game. It's just horribly made. The graphics are awful, right? Like it's not engaging, right? But what Minecraft is, it's this like canvas for creativity, right? And it's amazing to see how popular Minecraft is, especially with kids, right?
Right,
Because you
right.
think about it and you think about like I never would have imagined that video games as this incredible creative canvas. And I mean, you see the stuff that kids make in that, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
on such a basic platform, right?
Basic, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It does suck that they created such a basic platform, but
It doesn't suck. The fact that it's so basic is what's so incredible about it.
oh, I never thought about it like that. That
Yeah.
does make sense. All right, programming. I already know what you're gonna say.
Yeah, I mean, Underrated. I mean, I'll give, maybe just to make things interesting, I'll say there's a slice of people I think where programming is overrated, but I think by and large, yeah, underrated.
Right.
Like when we've got a programming course in every high school in the country, then maybe I'll change my answer.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, sports.
Overrated. Yes,
Overrated.
Finally this one. Yeah. I mean, and maybe I'll specifically say professional sports, right? I think like amateur sports, like sports for kids, right? Like league stuff. That's great. Like that's like beautiful. I do think like there's a point like getting into college where it starts to get kind of weird and gross, right?
Yeah.
And I will say the thing that really changed my view about this is talking to kids in the Mississippi Delta. So like I did some work down there when I was in school, and you talk to every single kid and you ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they say a basketball star. And at first you're like, oh, that's cute, right?
Uh-huh.
And then you realize that they literally don't know that there are any other professions, right?
Exactly.
They believe that that is the only path to success, and so they don't pursue academics. So that's why I think sports, I'd say overrated.
No, that's a great point. And I'm always saying, exposure, right? We go back to exposure, right? Because you're growing up and you're taught, because you're exposed to these things, you're exposed to this sport, and even sometimes, like you say, basketball only, right? There's other sports out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Basketball, football, things like that. Those are the only sports that you sort of see. And then in the Mississippi Delta, you would probably see that, right?
Right.
But you think about, there's other things out there, right? Why not exposure to data science, data analytics, right? At such an early age, Why not exposure to some of those things to be able to help educate them? It's all about exposure. I
think that's the thing, right? It's all about exposure. And that's also why, like, I think all the amateur and like little league stuff, that's awesome, right? I think probably too much focus on, whatever baseball and basketball and football, right? The main three, right? But I think even that's starting to change. It's kind of cool in the Olympics, right? Seeing like skateboarding and surfing and rock climbing, right? I think again, it's just like exposure. I think the more that is, cornhole, curling, right? It's like, I don't care, do it all, right? You never know what you're gonna love, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so energy drinks.
I'll go overrated on energy drinks.
Overrated. Okay.
Like I drink a lot of them.
We've got actually.
Oh man. All right. There's just a bit of Indico lore. So those big like 2-pound jelly bean things you get at Costco. Yeah. So we've got one of those, and like in the very first like couple of months of Indico, like my co-founder Diana turns to me and like we're both drinking Red Bulls, of course. She's like, all right, every time we finish a Red Bull, we take the tab off, put it in the jelly bean thing. It's like that thing is massive. So 7 years later, we're still filling it up. But there's like, I don't know, there's like 1,000 tabs in there or something.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but I don't drink them anymore. I think black coffee, that's nature's energy drink. That's right.
Yeah. No. When you drink things like Red Bulls and all that stuff, it can have its cons, right? If you overdose on them, for sure.
I mean, some folks go nuts on that.
Yeah. I've seen people do like 3 or 4 or 5, man, in a day, and I can do that because I get jittery just off of one sometimes,
Oh yeah, yeah.
But yeah. All right, ice cream.
I'll go overrated on ice cream. Only on very specific ice cream. I think like I'm more of a popsicle man myself. Yeah.
All right. Okay, last one. The printer.
Overrated, super overrated. In fact, I'm going like all physical media overrated. I literally don't carry cash. I take it as like a personal offense. It's why I will never go on a Greyhound bus again. They're the only bus that requires that you print it out. Overrated.
Yeah.
There's actually my biggest life hack. So the one thing I used to need a printer for was certified mail, right? So you like mailing, but there's a service now where you upload a PDF, they will print it out and send it for you. I'm just like, I'm all
Oh man, I know that just blew your mind. You was like,
Oh
thank you.
yeah, that changed my life.
Yeah, those things, they change your life, especially people that are really into technology. They're like, I hate anything that makes me print something out. I mean, if I ever
Yeah.
have to go to an airport and I somehow am having issues with my app, right, to be able to scan my boarding pass, if I
Yeah.
ever have to print anything out, I think I would. It kills me just to have to go there. I'm like, it's almost like you're like, oh man, I can't believe I'm with these people who have to print stuff out.
It's like in the 21st century, right? It is 2021 and I'm still.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So I get you. All right.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you again, Slater, for being on this podcast. Again, everybody, the audience, they always love they always love when I bring guests on like you who can educate them, not get too deep in technology, but they know that you're smart enough, you can do that, right? And
If you threaten me, I will.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So again, audience, thank you for listening to the Data is My Science podcast, the show that makes data your passion. This is your host, Dapper Data, and we've had a genius on here, right? I like to call it genius, somebody that is making a difference in the world from a technology standpoint, educational standpoint. Has a lot of great nuggets on how we can educate the generation and the kids in the future. Where can they reach you at, Slater? And is there anything that you're promoting now that you want, any conferences or anything like that, books or something?
Yeah, so we just did a relaunch of our website. Everyone should check out indicodata.ai.
Okay.
Yeah, and then if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out on Twitter or ask me a question on Quora. Thankfully, there's pretty much no one else with the first name Slater, so I'm not too
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And everybody, you can always subscribe to the Data is My Science podcast. The link is in the bio of my different social media platforms, Twitter, LinkedIn. You can always find me on Mr. Dapper Data within my social media posts, and also definitely check out my book, right? www.mrdapperdata.com/Dapper book. And thanks again, Slater. It's been a pleasure for having you on. And again, audience, definitely tune in next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.